What do you do when you've spent hours and hours on a watercolor painting and then you step back, it's all finished, you take a look at it, and you're like, I need to change something? This happened to me earlier this week when I spent hours over the weekend working on this floral painting. If you follow my channel at all, you know I'm not really a floral painter. I do paint flowers, but it's not my specialty. And especially when you're arranging whole compositions with tons of flowers, usually your reference photos aren't going to be perfect. You're going to have to find ways to change it to make it better. This was the case with this painting. I used multiple photos for reference and kind of pieced them together to create this composition. What I didn't do was create a thumbnail sketch ahead of time, and if I had done that, it probably would have saved me a lot of time. Instead, I thought, I can just kind of wing it. I know roughly what I want to do. I inserted a few extra flowers here and there and, leaves and background colors. I had an idea of what I wanted, but it wasn't completely fleshed out. And then when I looked at the finished painting, my vision for it was kind of this angular explosion of blooms coming across the painting. And I think I almost achieved it. Really close. The problem I'm seeing with my finished painting right now is that there's this kind of a dark line of leaves cutting through the painting and creating a disconnect between the blooms. So, finished painting, right? You can't really scrub this material. It's a Legion metal panel bonded to watercolor paper. This is the Stonehenge cold pressed watercolor paper bonded to the front. These are super nice archival panels. It's 12 by 16 inches, so pretty large. And it's not something I can just go back in and scrub or erase. Watercolor, especially if you use staining colors, it's really hard to do that. So, what's the solution? What I'm going to try today is watercolor ground. This is Daniel Smith watercolor ground, and basically it's a substrate that you can paint on almost any surface to prepare that surface for watercolor. Because it's pure white, my hope is that I can paint this on in the shape of the flower that I want to paint, restoring the surface so that it's paintable again, and putting a flower in where I want it to go. You don't have this issue with oil painting or acrylic. You can paint over it as much as you want. That's the nice thing about opaque paints, but with watercolors you really can't do that unless you start back at square one with white again. So we're going to give this a try and see if it works. Okay, so I have another reference image pulled up in front of me that has the bloom in about the shape that I want to create right here to create that connection of flowers all the way across. So before I paint my watercolor ground on into that flower shape, I'm going to take a pencil and lightly sketch the shape of the flower so that I know exactly where I want to paint my watercolor ground. I'm going to squint at it first. I'm probably going to need to cover up this whole area right here. And the question I'm asking myself is, how much of this leaf do I want to cover up? Do I want to cover up this petal or maybe just these darker shapes right here? And I'm thinking just the darker shapes here and some of these stems. So I think that's where I'm going to be putting this flower. I'll also probably cover up some of this shadowed petal here. It's pretty dark. I love this right here. I don't want to lose all of that, but this deep murky purple, I can get away with covering that up. So I'm just going to take my pencil and lightly sketch, or at least dark enough so I can see it. I'm going to sketch the shape of this flower that I'm going to put in right here. And it'll be a lot more clear when I can see with the white what I'm doing. It's hard to see with all this painting underneath, but we'll try that. Okay, I know you can't see my pencil lines. I'm going to hold it up so you can roughly see where I've put the pencil lines where I want to block in my flower shape. So I'm going to take the watercolor ground, and this will take a couple of coats. I'm going to take a cheap, small brush. I'm going to paint on a couple of coats. It's going to have to dry for about 24 hours in between. And we're going to go ahead and cover this area so it's back to pure white. I want it to be thin coats so it doesn't look like it's physically raised off the surface. But the thinner you paint it on, probably the more coats you'll need. So keep that in mind. Already, I'm liking that better. It's funny, I've only added a little bit of white, but I've covered up that very dark area that was creating the disconnect between my blooms, and I can tell this is going to be a good fix. It's going to look a little bit messy at first on this first coat. When we go back in with the second coat, that should be a little more solid white. And it'll be basically like starting over with a watercolor ready surface to paint this flower on and just fix this area. Now, of course, all of this could have just been prevented if I had done a thumbnail sketch and tested out my design ahead of time, or even done a little bit more photoshopping, but I didn't do that. And so sometimes when you see an error in your composition or in your painting, or you just mess something up, it's good to have a way to fix it. And of course, anyone looking really closely at your painting might see this difference in texture. But you know what? Might lend some extra character to the painting, right? By the way, since this is white and it works on all watercolors, you can use it as a pure white, opaque white to paint, highlights into things too if you wanted to do that. I've done that once or twice. It's not really my preferred method of painting white, but it does work. And if I want to, because this is adding just a little bit of texture on this one flower, I might want to go through and, add some textured white to some of the highlights within these flowers. I could do that, scattering around the texture throughout the painting so it's not just in only this one spot. Okay, I'm looking at my shape. Do I like the shape? Do I like where this is headed? Can you see the improvement in the composition as we've created that flow, that connection once again? So much better, even though this is a ghost flower with no detail yet. Okay, well, there's my bloom shape. I can decide if I want to adjust that at all. Right now is the time to do that. I think I'm going to give it one more little skinny petal right here, just to make it not such a perfect solid shape. So we'll let that dry, and then we'll get to come back and repaint the details once again. I was a little sorry to cover up this leaf. I was happy with how that turned out, but I think it'll be worth it in the end. Okay, so I applied a second coat, let it dry. It's been drying for over 24 hours, and I live in a really dry environment, so I'm confident that the surface is ready for me now to paint on. So I'm going to take a pencil. I had to obviously look at some other photos, some other references to get the shape of a flower that's close to something that'll work with this bunch of flowers. And, a lot of this is just kind of made up, so I'm going to do my best, but have to pencil very lightly, just enough so I can see where I want to paint my petals and make sure that it looks convincing, like a flower that can fit in with this environment around here. And these are really oversized, right? Very big. So I want to make sure that my petals on here aren't too small compared to some of these other ones. So that's the challenge, of course, is making it convincing so that it fits in with everything else around it. So a little bit of imagination goes a long way when you're trying to make a composition with flowers work, I think. So yeah, just a couple of almost made up overlapping petals, I think is all that needs. And then we can go ahead and start painting. Now, if you see this up close, you can see the watercolor ground created a little bit of extra texture on there. And so what I did was I took some very fine-grained sandpaper, just a little piece like this, and I sanded it down very lightly so that you can't really feel any of that texture anymore. Now, the watercolor ground surface is going to be a little different to paint on than the paper surface is. So I have to keep that in mind as I'm layering. Mostly I used a lot of quinacridone rose. These are actually all Roman Schmal paints, and quinacridone rose was my best friend in this painting. And so yeah, I'm going to get a slightly different texture than what I had with the paper. And I want to make sure I'm leaving lovely white edges, just like my other flower petals have. And at the base of each petal, I go more intense with the color, wet on wet, adding some hints of petal veins in there. I think it's going to blend in just fine. I'm really excited about this. Such a great option for fixing compositions, fixing mistakes, especially when you've finished the whole thing and you're just like, oh, there's something there that's bothering me. It's nice to know that there is an option out there for you. And so far, from what I'm seeing, this works just great. Really is such a beautiful meditative process, painting flowers. I'm liking it more and more. I've never considered myself a flower painter, as you know, but really been enjoying it, especially when I get to work detailed like this and at a larger scale. I think maybe it's just like the looser style of flowers that I haven't enjoyed as much, but painting with more detail, that's totally my jam. I can get into that. But I also love it when there's kind of this variety of loose and also tight within the same painting. I think that makes it so interesting. I think that fits in really well. And it's okay that it's not as vibrant as some of the other flowers around it. Yes, I think that was a good decision, even though I really liked my leaf, to just change the composition in that one area to create this greater flow throughout the painting so that the eye is led all the way around. So there you go. That is how you can fix a mistake, if you finished a painting you worked really hard on, just use your watercolor ground to hit the reset button and cover up an area with white so that you can paint it again. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching today.